that God wasn't all that much different from Spinoza's, really.
Right, but I was talking about the Greco-Roman pagans. I understand that there were Stoicists, etc.
Hmm.
And obviously, there were some very prominent Stoics in the Greco-Roman world, like Marcus Aurelius. But for most of them, it was being explained through these pagan signs, etc.
I think
And
it's more
and if you think about that, from explaining history as, the signs of the gods to the workings of through Jesus's divine plan or whatever, to what you get with Spinoza and Hegel, that's also in its own sense, it's the development of consciousness to more, rational self-determination, freedom, and able to understand its own becoming, if you think about it,
Oh
which
yeah.
matches the philosophy of history, I think, and Hegel's overarching system.
Yeah.
Like if you even look at how revolutionaries talked about themselves, just read the debates during the English Civil War, and it's all references to the Bible, etc., and the Reformation, of course.
Yeah.
You get, and Oliver Cromwell sees himself as like God's instrument. You get to the French Revolution, yeah, there's still mentions of God, but it's obviously more been very secularized, and it's through the lens of Rousseau, etc. All like these kind of these French materialists, etc. By the time you get to the Russian Revolution, it's obviously things are explained in terms of the class struggle, material forces, and in a sense where I think like the revolutionaries go from essentially Cromwell seeing himself as God's instrument, Robespierre seeing himself as, carrying out the general will, to Lenin viewing himself, as an instrument of history, of the class struggle going to that next stage. And you can just kind of see that progression of rationality getting much more precise with
Yeah.
each stage.
And it's not a delusion of grandeur, but rather a self-consciousness that is, uh, well, at the time was previously happened very, uh, uh, I mean, it didn't happen often that someone was that self-conscious to be like,
No, I mean, and Hegel admits it in the philosophy of history very early that world historical individuals, whether Caesar or whomever, they probably don't like Caesar was out for glory and power, but he carried out a much larger, mission, the cunning of reason.
yeah,
And, Oliver Cromwell and Robespierre saw themselves in certain ways. They didn't see themselves as like, oh, we're leading the bourgeois revolution in the sense that we're going to create a new exploitive system. Even if that's what ultimately happened. With Lenin, I think he understood his role, he understood history, and he really was this self-conscious world historical individual.
yeah,
And you're right, most people are not like that, and most people probably don't carry out their role with that level of self-consciousness.
right, yeah,
And the people who do think they're world historical, like I'm certain Adolf Hitler thought he was world historical, but he wasn't advancing freedom or rationality. It was something else that was brought upon with his rule.
yeah. I
Some commentators on Hegel have argued that Hegel's notion of the cunning of reason was derived, or at least influenced by, Adam Smith's invisible hand. The idea that, like in Smith, he was talking about, people acting in their own self-interest, but were because of of forces of competition in the market, they they wound up advancing the general interests of society, even though that was not their intention to do. They were just out for themselves. But the forces of competition led them to, advance the general interests of society, like developing the forces of production, for instance. in Hegel, in Hegel's space, saying something very similar, I think. People who might be like Caesar, just aiming for glory and political power, but was but for the material forces that were underlying what he was trying to do, he advanced Roman society, even if that was not necessarily his intention to do.
Yeah, this is where I get out of my depth a bit, but the difference between like a Hitler and a Napoleon is one in which the self-consciousness of the person is reflected, I think, in the self-consciousness of the masses. Like you look at Hitler, and he's basically talking at people, saying, if this is the way I think this needs to go, and if you don't like it, well, we're going to roll over you with tanks. Napoleon also rolled over people with tanks and, well, not tanks, but the
I
equivalent.
know what you mean with
But at
cavalry,
the
but
same time, the masses registered his consciousness, and so did Lenin's. In Lenin's time, Lenin's consciousness was reflected in the masses' consciousness, both in the workers as well as the peasants, which is why the Bolsheviks were so successful. We talk about peace, land, and bread hitting the target. This is this is an instance in which the parties and Lenin's um, consciousness of what's needed directly reflects what is actually needed, as opposed to, well, we think it is, and we're going to use force.
well,
It's not.
if you actually read Hegel on the French Revolution, he recognizes that first of all, like he's not like dismissive of the Jacobins. He thinks it's a necessary historical phase.
Yeah.
And but they can bring down the old regime, but like there needs to be this stabilizing period to bring in the new society. And he recognizes that that brings in like the spiritual animal kingdom of like bourgeois modernity, etc. And Napoleon is an expression of that kind of phase, because he on the in the same sense that he gets rid of the republic, and he's a counter-revolutionary in that respect. Like, but he codifies it with the Napoleonic Code. Even when he becomes emperor, he's laying the foundations for this bourgeois society. These rational foundations, which he extends throughout Europe, which, Hegel obviously encounters him. Unfortunately, that scene is not in the movie. But the Napoleon movie, which sucks. But he does all that. So even when Napoleon is overthrown, he's laid the groundwork for bourgeois modernity to take hold. After it's gone through the necessary phase of Jacobinism. Hitler and fascism is, bourgeois society has already been enshrined in Germany, and it's like this counter-revolutionary downturn. In a sense, they're both bourgeois politicians, but Hitler is part of like a rescue package to save, a society in crisis that's falling apart. And he does rescue it, but obviously at the cost of like leading Germany into war and, genocide, where Napoleon, yeah, he does bring France into war, but he does also stabilize the whole revolutionary, impetus that has been unleashed. And obviously with Lenin and the Bolsheviks in 1917, etc., they're at a moment where history is open. There's this revolutionary situation, and they're actually, like you said, they're actually able to intervene with their program and demands that pretty much meet the demands of the rising people, the workers and peasants of Russia. And they're actually able to progress that to take power. When Lenin says, we shall now construct the socialist order, it's an expression partly, I guess, of his own role as the leader of this revolution, but also seeing like we've overcome, or we're in the process of overcoming capitalism, and we can now take these first steps in the next stage of history. So even, we can debate the class character of the Soviet Union, but when they called themselves the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they really hadn't done, at that point, they retreated from a lot of, they really had taken only baby steps towards socialism at that point. But it was also a recognition of the potential to go there, that they were starting that long march.
Yeah. Shit. That's dead on. Yeah. Um,
I'm sorry if I distracted this
no, no, no,
conversation
no, no,
from.
no. I'm trying to think this through because right now we're in the point in quantum where we're getting into the quantitative infinity, and I'd love to spend next time talking about it and where we were. But honestly, it almost sounds like we should take a week or a couple weeks, not off, but just meet next Monday and continue this conversation as you catch up.
You don't have to change
Would you agree?
anything for me. I'm taking my time, and if I'm fall behind, that's my own fault. But I wanted to make sure that that I just started over. It just takes
No,
time.
no, and it's great. That it's what I want to encourage, Doug, because honestly, this is the most you've talked in the Hegel group in the entire time we've been doing this, at least for the science of logic. And I want to keep it going because
Yeah.
you're making all kinds of good points. It's not a distraction. If anything, you're
Well, I also
like filling
it's
out a
really
lot.
hard to understand. I was actually paying very close attention to what I could.
Plus,
And
one thing, sorry, what I've run into is I've gotten so far into the weeds of this stuff that I'm not even seeing the forest through the trees at some time. So stepping back out is also useful for me at this point too.
Sure. I mean, this is a personal thing I do when I read most texts is I'm generally reading other texts at the same time. Sometimes it's related, sometimes it's not, in the hope that it sparks a connection between the different spheres. So maybe I'm reading on China and Hegel or the Russian Revolution or whatever, in the hope that it sparks some ideas.
Yeah.
So
Uh,
I
Kyle,
have
you
talked a fair amount in this group, probably not in the last few months.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Kyle, you brought up about the second brain and how helpful it is. Uh, he's talking about what he means is taking notes. Um, Basically, you read something over, you got it, you write it down, and you move on to the next thing and you clear it out. With the logic, you really have to clear out that short term memory and keep the long term on a paper that you can uh refer to because there's just so much and at the different levels he brings back conversations about the qualitative like in this section he brings back qualitative infinity and he reminds you that the qualitative infinity uh in itself was like
I do with qualitative limits, right?
yeah the so like
Where qualitative limit is where something ends,
yeah
but yeah,
I can't even paraphrase it yet, and this gets to part of your difficulty, Doug. I have the same
right.
one. But like if I read 226, he says the difference between the qualitative and quantitative infinite is that in the former, the qualitative, the finite and infinite are qualitatively opposed, and the transition of the finite into the infinite, or the relation of each to the other, lies only in itself, in their notion. Qualitative determinateness as an immediacy is related to otherness essentially as an alien being, like an other, right? Uh, it is not posited as having its negation, its other within it. In quantitative, it is. In qualitative, it is not. It appears as an unbridgeable opposite, which, of course, in the proof uh, turns out to be false. But it appears to be an opposite. Yeah, he says quantity, on the other hand, is as such subbladed determinateness. It is posited as being unlike and indifferent to itself, consequently is alterable. Therefore, the qualitative finite and infinite stand absolutely, that is, abstractly opposed to each other. Their unity is their underlying inner relation, inner relation only. And therefore, the finite continues itself into its other only implicitly, not affirmatively. The quantitative finite, on the other hand, is self-related in its infinite, in which it has its absolute determinateness. This, the relation, is displayed in the first place in the quantitative infinite progress. And then he talks about the quantitative infinite progress, which is the number line that never ends, right? But the point is, in the qualitative circle, you look at opposites, and the fact that they're actually related is a relation outside of itself, or is it a relation only in itself? Kyle, I forget.
So
Like-
what part is that again? Sorry, I kind of.
Oh, you're fine. No, the what point was I trying to make? Yeah, the point I was trying to make is that he the stuff in the sphere of being before you get to quantum, for example, when you get to finite and infinite, you're not going to understand the entire shape of it. When you get to quantum and he talks about quantitative infinite, he relates it back to being and brings what being by itself in its finite and infinite shape looks like. In other words, it stands opposed to itself as opposed to both of them being posited as being a polarity.
I think I'll say that quantitative infinity also is already the sublated qualitative infinity, so they're already connected. I mean,
Yeah, they're already connected, only in quantity they're also explicitly connected. Like you can see it externally. If you have a number line that never ends, you can see infinity quantitatively expressed, as opposed to abstractly with being, which turns out to be difficult to express except as opposites, right? And their connection is only implicit, like it's not posited yet, but it is. It exists. We already talked about it. The finite and the infinite are connected, but it has to be proven. It doesn't just show up on the surface. When you get to quantum, it does show up on the surface. It's external. You can see the number line. You can see into a telescope, right? And see the infinite vastness that just keeps going, right? You can look at the clock and see the infinite time ticking by that had no beginning and no end, so on and so forth. But when you're just talking about being, sort of the qualitative infinite and finite, they have to be, they're like parts. They have to be connected together in order to be shown to be connected. And Hegel does that in the first circle, through the logic. But yeah, and once it is connected by the logic, then it is sublated as connected in quantity, and in quantity you can see it. I don't know if any of that made sense.
I guess I also have down that
No, but I'm behind, so it's all right.
also do have down that qualitative infinity just shows kind of it's a negation of the finite. So this is a spurious or the bad one, which shows itself merely as a finite infinity, which it has another implied beyond, which again, because you're back to the finite, so it's just sort of this points forward where quantitative immediately pushes itself into its own beyond, which itself creates its own limit, which is it's basically self-propelled at that point.
And each time it repels itself, it reemerges as affirmative instead of negative.
Right.
Yeah. So in that way, it's the same as the qualitative version, only you can see it in its externality, like in time and space or on a number line, so on and so forth.
It's yeah, I guess it's just to say that they do have different properties to an extent, and of course, just to kind of briefly go over this section, it's very common people conflate the two without realizing it because they're both it's infinity.
Well, yeah, well, yes, because you can see the quantitative in
Yeah.
the real world in various representations. If you're just talking about the abstraction of being, you can't really see it. It's in,
Right.
you can even contemplate it in your head. Each appears to be separated from each other in their difference, which is why the logic was needed to connect the two, because Kant's critical philosophy, unfortunately, saw all of the opposites as unbridgeable antinomies. That was half the point of the circle of being, was to show that it wasn't actually all disconnected parts, like in you open, you know like you open up an anatomy book, and someone's body appears to be all disconnected parts that all have their own functions, separate from each other, when the truth is that they're only in their truth when they're all connected, which is, I think, why he uses that representation when he's talking about philosophy, is that philosophy like anatomy would never function correctly if it was just a bunch of loosely related parts that were unconnected. That anatomy is a bad science by itself for the conduct of surgery, right? In the same way, philosophy, if it was treated the same way, would fall apart, and it does. Bourgeois philosophers treat different philosophers' philosophies as so much bric-a-brac that they stack together, but never connect. Hegel connects them all and says this is all a philosophical timeline. There is the history of philosophy is philosophy in its whole connectedness. This is why he connects the Eleatics to Heraclitus, to Socrates and Plato, to Aristotle, all the way to today. Well, his day, and says that it's a fully connected spectrum, not just a bunch of coincidences or competing philosophies. He says there's no such thing as competing philosophies, it's all one. And Kai Pan, as they said at Tübingen. Did any of that make sense? Maybe not.
Hmm.
It's how it plays it out in my head. Sorry. God. Doug, do you think we're going to be recording our first session on Thursday?
I don't know.
Okay. Because if we are, I may or may not have the equipment to do it yet, in full. Which is fine. I'm honestly not sure what the timeline is, so I'll have to ask Aaron later. But Kyle, you wanted to finish talking about the section really quick. Go ahead.
Yeah.
We've got the
You went into exactly what I was going about, exactly what I was talking about. So there's
yeah, there's the quantitative infinite progress, and then he goes into the remarks, and the remarks are really easy to read. He goes into the high repute of the progress to infinity and how it's made this object of sublime honor to to see on the number line or space and time,
Is
you know.
the beyond that.
Yeah, 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 the beyond.
It's wholly in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and Kant, and he talks about how Kant misses the point of Haller's description of eternity. Haller says, "I heap up monstrous numbers, pile millions upon millions. I put eon upon eon and world upon world, and when from that awful height reeling, again I seek thee, all the might of number increased 1,000-fold is still not a fragment of thee." And the final line, which Kant misses, "I remove them, and thou liest wholly before me," which is basically Haller's way of saying, if I abandon the quantitative infinite contemplation, what's actually qualitatively infinite becomes clearer, right? And which is Hegel's point, right? And then of course he gets to the quote about the astronomers,
Yeah.
and how
Proud they are about all the infinite stuff. They
yeah, and how they worship the quantitative infinitude when it's actually the relations of measure and the laws which reason recognizes in these objects, which is the actual excellence of the science. I yeah. Um, and so there's that. It's quite interesting. And he
Do you think the part what was it that Kant seems in order was not able to bridge the gap of qualitative infinity, so he ended up in quantitative infinity and summarized it to a difference,
yeah,
which is
and yeah, and Hegel talks about how Fichte continues Kant's separation of the ego, us, from the non-ego nature, and says it's unbridgeable, which is kind of expressed in this way. And so there are some good things that Hegel takes from Fichte, but there's also things that he criticizes in Fichte. And this is one of those. Remark 2 goes into the Kantian antinomy of the limitation and non-limitation of the world and time and space. And what this boils down to is two separate theses. Okay. The first thesis says the world has a beginning in time and is also enclosed within spatial limits. The antithesis, the second proof, is the world has no beginning and no limits in space, but is infinite with reference both to time and space. And Hegel demolishes both within the second remark.
He's pretty
But
much Holgate pretty much summarizes Hegel's interpretation of like, well, Kant treats it as like a qualitative limit. It's kind of like, well, the universe, like here's a time, and then now that the past ends and the future begins, but you can't have infinity end. So Hegel's like, wait, this is basically uh continuous and discrete magnitude, and trying to argue you can't have one without the you have if you have one you can't have the other.
yeah,
So basically it's like I've already proven yeah, so it's pretty much just like, yeah, you in time as a quantity is able to move on flow without changing its quality. I know that's a really dirty summary because I still feel like I got to read Holgate further, but
yeah, and really to get the full flavor of it, you have to go read Kant to see what Kant actually says, because one of Holgate's points in his new book, which is the 2 volumes, the Hegel on Being, is that there's Kant, and then there's Hegel, and then there's Hegel's Kant, and sometimes Hegel's Kant isn't actually what Kant says, um, and it's real subtle, but it's the case, and you know. Uh, that that's an extreme digression. from what I was talking about. I'm kind of looking ahead, trying to get a bead on this remark, because he starts to do the math. Hang on just a second.
I'm gonna have to jump off pretty soon.
Yeah, yeah, to that, I take what you're saying, Doug, that you don't want us to stop, but Kyle, Jim, what if we just take a week? Not take a week off, but we'll meet next Monday, but just continue this discussion
Kind of
where
a
we are,
review is what I
you know, and just, you know, and just sort of call it a review. And you can talk about anything you like, from the prefaces all the way up until where we are in quantum. Because going into the next section, you start to go into the math, and that's you know, that's where he starts to lose me and he starts to get you, Kyle. So
Yeah.
how's that sound to everybody? We'll meet
Yep.
next Monday at 8, and we'll continue sort of a review and see where we are. Sound good?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay,
You
great.
want?
We're no, this is good, because I'm sure there's stuff I need to relook at as well. All right. Great session, folks. Really appreciate it.